Good afternoon. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives, whether you're here in person or joining us on our YouTube channel. Before we hear from Max Boot about his new book, The Road Not Taken, Edward Lansdale and the American Tragedy in Vietnam, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up this month. Tomorrow evening at 7 p.m., we'll show the Emmy Award-winning HBO documentary, Dear America, Letters Home from Vietnam. Based on the book of the same name, this 1987 film features actors and actresses reading actual letters home from men and women serving in the Vietnam War. And it will be introduced by Bernard Edelman, who edited the book upon which the film is based. And then on Thursday, January 25th at 7, we'll host a panel discussion on Vietnam, the Tet Offensive. Eric Villard and other guests will discuss the Tet Offensive and Villard's book, Combat Operations, Staying the Course, September 1967 to October 1968. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events online at archives.gov. Check out our website or sign up at the table outside the theater to get email updates. You'll also find information about other National Archives activities and programs. Another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the Foundation, National Archives Foundation, which supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are applications for membership in the lobby also. Our current special exhibit, Remembering Vietnam, in the Lawrence F. O'Brien Gallery upstairs, explores the Vietnam War through historical records and contemporary interviews with Americans and Vietnamese, both veterans and civilians. The exhibit is on display all year, a time that marks the 50th anniversary of the height of America's war in Vietnam. Just 2 weeks from now is the 50th anniversary of the Tet Offensive. Now I ask all Vietnam veterans and any United States veterans who served on active duty in the United States Armed Forces at any time during the period November 1st, 1955 to May 15th, 1975, to stand and be recognized. Veterans, as you exit the McGowan Theater after today's program, National Archives staff and volunteers will present each of you with the Vietnam Veteran lapel pin. On the back of the pin is embossed, "A grateful nation thanks and honors you." The United States of America Vietnam War Commemoration is a national initiative, and the lapel pin is the nation's lasting memento of thanks. Remembering Vietnam draws on National Archives records from all parts of our agency: federal, civilian, and military records, presidential libraries, still photography and motion pictures, sound recordings, and electronic records. By showcasing our records and exhibits such as Remembering Vietnam, we also bring attention to our primary mission to preserve and make accessible the records of the federal government. Every year, tens of thousands of researchers come to our research rooms, and more use our online resources. Some of this documentary mining results in important books about our nation's history, and today's guest author, Max Boot, sought out records not only from several record groups, but for many of our locations. For his work on The Road Not Taken, Edward Lansdale and the American Tragedy in Vietnam, Boot used records from the Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon presidential libraries, as well as State Department, OSS, CIA, Department of Defense, and the Kennedy Assassination Review Board records at the National Archives at College Park. I'm pleased to welcome a scholar who is familiar with our documentary resources and uses them to tell the important stories of America's past. Max Boot is a military historian, best-selling author, and foreign policy analyst who has been called one of the world's leading authorities on armed conflict. Boot is the Jean J. Kirkpatrick Senior Fellow in National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and is a frequent public speaker and guest on radio and television news programs. He's lectured on behalf of the United States State Department and at many military institutions. In 2004, he was named by the World Affairs Council of America as one of the 500 most influential people in the United States in the field of foreign policy. And in 2007, he won the Eric Brindell Award for Excellence in Opinion Journalism, given annually to the writer who exhibits love of country and its democratic institutions and bears witness to the evils of totalitarianism. Before joining the council in 2002, Boot spent 8 years as a writer and editor at the Wall Street Journal, the last 5 as op-ed editor. And from 1992 to 1994, he was an editor and writer at the Christian Science Monitor. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Max Boot.
We're going to have the PowerPoint on this. There it is. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, David, for that great introduction. It's a delight to be here with all of you to be able to talk about this book in the very place where I did the research. Well, not exactly this place, because a lot of the research was done at the National Archives in Maryland and at the presidential libraries, as David mentioned, but in this place in a holistic sense at NARA. And I'm very grateful for the tremendous work that everybody here does in preserving our nation's heritage, our records, and making possible books like this one that I really could not imagine without the assistance of the first-rate archival team here. Well, I'm here to talk about my book, obviously, The Road Not Taken. I probably missed a trick by not calling it Fire and Fury. I probably would have sold a few more volumes if I had done that. The subject of my book is this man, Major General Edward G. Lansdale, who was undoubtedly one of the oddest general officers in the history of the United States Air Force and probably of any military service. He was somebody who at one time was quite famous. He was said to be the model for both the quiet American and the ugly American. He was written about by pretty much every author who has written about the Vietnam War, sometimes in very positive terms, sometimes in not so positive terms. And if you go online, you will even find a burgeoning conspiracy theory trying to assert that Ed Lansdale was the mastermind of the Kennedy assassination. And if you believe the stuff that you read online, you would think that this photo taken in Dallas on November 22, 1963 shows Ed Lansdale from the back. And that's a pretty flimsy basis on which to accuse somebody of being the mastermind of a presidential assassination. Nevertheless, he has that infamy, and it was even, oddly enough, the basis for an entire movie by Oliver Stone, the movie JFK, which has very little, in fact, no foundation in fact. Well, I would quote to you the words of General Brut Krulak, who was one of Ed Lansdale's bureaucratic competitors in the Pentagon in the 1960s. He said, "There are few individuals in my knowledge more damned and at the same time applauded. History is going to have to portray Lansdale's real part." That's where I come in. I am the voice of history because I've spent the last 5 years trying to figure out who the real Ed Lansdale was and trying to get beyond some of the myths, good and bad, that have accumulated around him over the decades. So who was Ed Lansdale? Well, he was born in 1908 in Detroit. He was a very middle-class kid. He was not somebody who was to the manor born. He didn't go to the Ivy League, didn't work on Wall Street like so many of the so-called wise men who created U.S. foreign policy in the post-World War II era. He had a much more modest upbringing. That's Ed, by the way, as a boy right there with his family. His father, Harry, who was an automotive executive in the very early days of the automobile industry at a time when companies were going boom and bust, and many of his employers did not survive. And so as a result of that, the Lansdale family had their fortunes go up and down. Sometimes they were flush, sometimes they were very poor. Ed Lansdale, as I said, was born in Detroit, then spent a couple of years in Bronxville, New York, but most of his early years were spent in California, out in LA. And he became in many ways a quintessential Californian. He was very informal. He did not like hierarchy. He was kind of a maverick. He did not like wearing neckties. He was kind of a proto-Silicon Valley kind of guy long before Silicon Valley was ever formed. There are a couple of other aspects of his upbringing that are worth pointing out very briefly. One is that although he was not a great student, and his life story should give inspiration to every C student out there, he was a great devotee of the Founding Fathers, and he loved reading the documents of the founding. He was particularly devoted to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and their ideals would become his lodestars as he came to represent American policy in Asia. The other point that's worth bringing out is that he grew up at a time in the 1910s and 20s of virulent racism. There was a lot of prejudice, especially against Asian Americans in California. And Lansdale was never contaminated with that prejudice. And I've read pretty much all of the letters and essays and all his other writings that I could possibly find, and I saw no evidence anywhere of any kind of racial prejudice, not even the kind of racial slurs that were very common at that time. He always looked upon everybody of whatever race or ethnicity as being a fellow human being, just as worthy of respect as somebody who happened to be white and middle class like him. And there's one aspect of his background that I think gave him special empathy and sympathy with ethnic minorities, and that is the fact that he was also a minority because his family were Christian Scientists at a time when this was a very small religion that was looked down upon by the mainstream of society. And so he knew what it was like to be an outsider, and that gave him sympathy with other outsiders. Now, Ed Lansdale went to public schools in LA. He went to UCLA, dropped out a few credits short of graduation at the height of the Great Depression, and moved to New York, hoping to become a New Yorker writer or cartoonist. It didn't quite work out. And so, like many a frustrated creative type before him, he went into advertising and had a pretty successful advertising career in California in the 1930s. And that's Ed Lansdale with some of his colleagues at an ad agency in San Francisco. And this is one of the ads they put together. That's Ed Lansdale himself right there. As you might imagine, December 7th, 1941, the day that will live in infamy, was also a day that changed Ed Lansdale's life forever, as it changed the lives of everybody in this country. He was eager to get into the struggle. He wanted to contribute to the war effort, but he had trouble doing so initially because he was overage, had some health problems, so could not get into the Army right away. And instead, he went into the OSS, America's first civilian intelligence agency. He spent the war years for OSS right here stateside. He wasn't deployed abroad. And what he did was he interviewed travelers who had information about the strange and mysterious places where Allied troops would shortly be landing, everywhere from northern Africa to the islands of the Pacific. And in the course of doing that, he revealed himself to be a very skilled listener, Lansdale the listener. And that was one of the essential skill sets that he would take with him on his later career as a counterinsurgent and nation builder in Asia. Now in 1945, in the fall of 1945, as millions of American GIs were coming home from the war, Ed Lansdale was deploying abroad on his first permanent overseas assignment to the Philippines. This is Ed Lansdale on a leaky rice boat surveying some of the newly liberated islands of Japan, acting really as an anthropologist in uniform as much as anything else. He was determined to find out as much as he could about the country where he now found himself, and he was particularly fascinated by the Hook Rebellion, H-U-K, pronounced Hook, the communist insurgency that was just starting with the end of World War II in the Philippines. And this is Lansdale in the 1940s with some captured hooks here. Lansdale constantly went out into the countryside. He was fascinated by Filipino culture, folklore, myths, food. Everything about the Philippines was a subject of fascination to him. He was trying to learn as much as possible about this country where he was deployed. Now, by this point, he was already married. In 1933, he had married Helen, a small-town girl from upstate New York. They had a couple of kids. But when he deployed to the Philippines in 1945, he met this woman, Pat Kelly, who was a Filipina war widow. Her name came from her late husband, who was of Irish-Filipino ancestry. And she was somebody who was very unusual for the Philippines of the 1940s because she was an independent single mother working. She was a journalist, eventually went to work for the U.S. Information Agency in Manila, a very strong, feisty, smart person. And Lansdale was initially drawn to her because she came from the same part of Luzon where many of the Hooks were from. In fact, she had gone to high school with Louis Taruc, the leader of the Hook Rebellion. And so Lansdale enlisted her as a tour guide to take him into the boondocks, into the back country of the Philippines on often dangerous forays to meet with these rebels and to find out what their grievances were. He wanted to learn what they were all about. Well, as he was doing this, a friendship was forged, and then before long, a romance. And Pat Kelly became in many ways the great love of his life. Now, one of the great advantages I had in writing this book was not only having access to newly declassified official documents here at the National Archives, but also getting my hands on this amazing treasure trove of letters, the love letters that Pat Kelly and Ed Lansdale exchanged over the course of many, many years, which are still held by her grandchildren who live right here in Northern Virginia. And these letters really allow me to tell the inner story of Ed Lansdale in a way that it's never been told before, especially when combined with the letters that he also wrote, often simultaneously, to his first wife, Helen, which were provided to me by his kids. Kids, I say, now they're in their 60s and 70s, who live in New York and in Florida. And so I was actually the first person after Ed Lansdale himself to read both sets of letters, the ones written both to his longtime mistress, Pat Kelly, as well as to his first wife, Helen Lansdale. And they provide this unrivaled perspective on the inner Ed Lansdale and allow me to really, I think, provide a fuller and more rounded and more informed portrait of Ed Lansdale than any previous author has been able to do. And of course, it also gave me a vantage point into some of the awkward moments and some of the personal turmoil of his life. Like, for example, when in 1947, 1948, when his wife Helen and his boys, Ed and Pete, came to live with him in Manila. As my teenage daughter would say, awkward, considering that he was also seeing Pat Kelly at the very same time. And this was one of his greatest secret operations as a covert operative, was to juggle these two women somehow simultaneously. He did ask his wife for a divorce. She refused, and this was a time when it was very hard to get a contested divorce. So they stayed married, but he spent much of the next 10 years or more deployed abroad in Asia. And so, like many spouses of deployed soldiers, Helen wound up being de facto a single mother, having to raise her kids largely by herself in Washington and doing a pretty good job of it. One thing I want to stress about the relationship between Pat Kelly and Ed Lansdale is that this was not just a relationship that was of great personal importance to Lansdale, although it was also a relationship that was of great professional importance, because Pat Kelly really provided an entree for Ed Lansdale into Filipino culture, allowed him to assimilate and to learn about the Philippines in a way that's very hard for an outsider to do, and that in turn set the stage for his greatest triumph, which began in 1950 at a very dark time for the United States. This was when the Korean War was going on. This was shortly after the fall of China to the communists. This was shortly after the Soviet Union had acquired an atomic bomb. This was as the McCarthyite scare was picking up steam. There was a widespread feeling in Washington that all of Asia was on the verge of going, quote unquote, red, and we had to do something about this. Well, because we were already engaged in all-out war in Korea, there were no troops to spare for the Philippines, although the Joint Chiefs of Staff did draw up plans to send multiple army divisions to fight the Hooks if necessary, because there was great fear at the time that Louis Taruk, the leader of the Hooks, would in fact be the next communist leader in East Asia to take over a major country. But rather than sending troops to fight Taruk and the Hooks, the decision was made in Washington to instead send Ed Lansdale. And by this time, he was working for a small, super secret intelligence agency called OPC, the Office of Policy Coordination, which would shortly be folded into the CIA as its covert action arm. And so in 1950, Ed Lansdale was dispatched to Manila. And this is Ed Lansdale here in his bungalow in Manila at the head of the table. This is his friend Bob Shapley, the New Yorker correspondent, his deputy, the eccentric former Smithsonian anthropologist Bo Bohannon, and these are some of the Filipinos with whom they worked. And this picture really gives you a good microcosm of the way that Ed Lansdale liked to operate, because he hated formal meetings with agendas and hierarchy and all the rest of it. He liked to just sit around in his bungalow and shoot the breeze over coffee in a very informal, laid-back, relaxed kind of way. And out of these coffee clutches would emerge the ideas that would defeat the Hook Rebellion. The most important thing that Ed Lansdale did was to befriend this man, Ramon Magsaysay, who at the time was this energetic young senator, former guerrilla fighter against the Japanese, who had just been appointed defense minister. He was a reformer. He was a person of integrity. He was not corrupt. He wanted to fight the hooks effectively, but he didn't know how to do it. And Ed Lansdale essentially became his one-man brain trust. They, in fact, became very close, Lansdale and Magsaysay. They became as close as brothers. They were even roommates for a while. They toured the Philippine countryside together and developed what would today be called the Doctrine of CounterInsurgency. The insight that Lansdale had was that the Philippine army was not going to defeat the hooks with massive use of force. In fact, he believed they were using too much force. He told them, stop bombarding these barrios with artillery. You're going to create more enemies than you eliminate. Instead of being heavy-handed and repressive, act as brothers to the people, embrace the people, win the trust of the people. And if you do that, they will rat out the insurgents in their midst. I mean, today, a lot of this sounds like counterinsurgency 101, but this was far from conventional wisdom in the early 1950s. Ed Lansdale was really one of the pioneers who developed a lot of this thinking. He also developed some other approaches to fighting the hooks that were a little bit more different from what would normally be expected. He was, let's recall this, an advertising man, and so he loved psychological warfare, which is the military version of advertising. And he knew a lot about Filipino folklore, and one of the things that he knew was that there were all these legends about the aswang, these vampires who were said to haunt the Philippine countryside. And so he decided to put the fear of the aswang into the hooks with the help of the Philippine army, who took a dead hook and put a couple of puncture wounds in his neck to give the impression that he had been killed by one of these aswang. And then they spread the rumors around and made the local hook unit believe that supernatural forces were operating against him. This became part of the Lansdale legend, told and retold at the CIA along the lines of, hey, can you believe what this guy did? But I don't want to give the impression that Lansdale defeated the hooks through dirty tricks and psychological operations. The way he really beat the hooks, his main line of operations, was political, because he understood that the appeal of the hooks lay in their slogan, which was bullets, not ballots. And why bullets, not ballots? Because people in the Philippines could not trust the voting process because the elections were rigged. They were fixed. There was an oligarchy that controlled much of the society, these feudal landlords, and they also controlled the electoral process. And so these poor, oppressed young peasants, if they wanted to have any kind of change in their terrible conditions, they had to take up guns and bombs and fight for it. Well, Lansdale was determined to reverse that equation, to give people faith once again in the political process. He did that by enlisting Filipino civic organizations to safeguard the balloting, to make sure that the vote was free and fair. And then, as his ultimate coup, he convinced Magsaysay to run for president in 1953 and served as his virtual campaign manager. And if any of you are interested in running a presidential campaign in the developing world, I would strongly recommend to you a document that I was lucky enough to read at the courtesy of the National Archives, which was Lansdale's top secret report to his boss, CIA Director Alan Dulles, on how he won the 1953 presidential election in the Philippines. And he didn't do it with fraud. He didn't stuff the ballot box, none of that. It was basically politics 101. Lansdale did everything from helping to write a campaign song for Magsaysay to coming up with his campaign slogan, Magsaysay is my guy. And so Magsaysay became known throughout the Philippines as the guy. And thanks to Lansdale's expert campaign management on behalf of the CIA, Magsaysay was in fact elected in a landslide in 1953, and this is Magsaysay being inaugurated. And that's really the event that destroyed the Hook Rebellion, because seeing this honest reformer, receptive to the people, getting elected president, destroyed the Hook's rationale for fighting. Louis Taruc gave up the struggle shortly thereafter. Most of his followers did the same. And this became one of the great untold success stories of the Cold War for the United States, a success story that was achieved without sending a single American soldier into combat. And as you might imagine, Ed Lansdale became quite a popular figure in Washington among the handful of people who knew what he had done, including principally, of course, CIA Director Alan Dulles. And so it's not terribly surprising that when the U.S. was shortly thereafter faced with another major challenge in Southeast Asia, thoughts turned to perhaps using Ed Lansdale to solve this problem, just as he had solved the problem in the Philippines, where, by the way, he had acquired a new nickname. He was known as Colonel Landslide Lansdale, for orchestrating Magsaysay's victory. Well, the new challenge was one that occurred in 1954, where the French forces were beaten at Dien Bien Phu by the Viet Minh, and this was a photo that I took at the museum in Dien Bien Phu, which I would recommend anybody who gets out that way. As a result of that, the Geneva Convention was held, which partitioned Vietnam between North Vietnam, which would be led by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, i.e. the communists, and South Vietnam, which was supposed to be a non-communist state. But the question was, how on earth could you form a viable artificial state in South Vietnam? Well, the answer that people in Washington had was, let's get Ed to do it. And so in the summer of 1954, Ed Lansdale was sent to Saigon, and his marching orders from Allen Dulles were basically verbatim, do what you did in the Philippines. And he actually did do what he did in the Philippines, because the first thing that he did was he understood that just as he'd had an important protege in Ramon Magsaysay in the Philippines, he needed a new protege in South Vietnam, and he found him in this man, Ngo Dinh Diem, who was newly appointed Prime Minister of South Vietnam just a few weeks after Lansdale arrived. He was this Catholic Confucian Mandarin who had been a minister under the French but had quit and had credentials as an opponent of both colonialism and communism. But very few people imagined in the summer of 1954 that he would last 9 weeks, much less 9 years. And the fact that he did succeed in consolidating his power was largely due to the help and advice that he received from Ed Lansdale. Lansdale cultivated, there's Lansdale, there's Diem. Lansdale cultivated Diem much as he had cultivated Magsaysay, which was not so easy to do because, for starters, he didn't speak the language. Magsaysay spoke English, but Lansdale, being kind of a typical American, had very little linguistic ability. He did not speak French or Vietnamese, so he had to talk to Diem through a translator. But even so, he was able to be very effective in winning Diem's trust and confidence. And how did he do that? He did it. His secret weapon was listening. He didn't lecture, he listened. Now we Americans and Westerners in general, when we go out to the developing world, we love to lecture and tell people what to do. And that wasn't Lansdale's method of operating at all. He listened, and that wasn't easy to do with somebody like Diem, because Diem became notorious for his long-windedness. He would deliver these hours-long monologues that would bore the pants off of most Americans. But Ed Lansdale was made of sterner stuff. He had endless patience and probably a pretty good bladder. He would sit there hour after hour listening to Lansdale drone on, and then when Lansdale was done, when Diem was done, he would listen to Diem drone on, and when Diem was done, Lansdale would say to him, fascinating. If I understand what you're saying X, Y, and Z. And then he would very subtly rephrase what Diem had told him, putting it across his own ideas as if they were Diem's. This is a very subtle but a very effective method of operating. It made Diem think that he was generating all these great ideas on his own, even though they were actually being implanted by Ed Lansdale. And by winning Diem's confidence and trust, Lansdale was able to carry out a very ambitious agenda to stabilize and really to create this new state of South Vietnam, including doing things like Operation Passage to Freedom, which was his massive operation done with the help of the U.S. Navy to move 900,000 refugees from North Vietnam to South Vietnam in 1954, 1955, many of them Catholic refugees, thereby greatly strengthening the state of South Vietnam. And of course, Lansdale, with his love of psyops, couldn't help but use psyops to encourage the migration. He did things like, for example, hiring a soothsayer to predict bad fortune for North Vietnam and good fortune for South Vietnam. Another one of his initiatives, and he was an early pioneer in civic action, he actually coined the term, another one of his initiatives was Operation Brotherhood, where he brought over Filipino doctors and nurses to Vietnam to provide free medical care in order to make people more sympathetic to the government. This was done by this ostensibly independent civic organization in the Philippines called Operation Brotherhood, but don't tell anybody, it was actually created and funded by the CIA, by Ed Lansdale to be exact. Now, not everybody in the U.S. government agreed with what Ed Lansdale was doing. Not everybody thought that the CIA officer should become a political kingmaker and shaper of destiny in Vietnam and the Philippines. And one of the people who disagreed was Lansdale's boss, General Lightning Joe Collins, this four-star general who had fought in both the European and Pacific theaters in World War II and was appointed by President Eisenhower as his ambassador in Saigon. At their very first country team meeting, General Collins announced that he wanted to reduce the size of the South Vietnamese army because it was too expensive to pay for this large force. Well, Ed Lansdale disagreed with him because he said we need a large army in South Vietnam because they have to take control of the countryside, the areas that are being vacated by the Viet Minh, and there's no other part of the Vietnamese government that has any capacity. Plus, they need to absorb all these sect militias in order to prevent all of these private armies from running around the countryside. Well, Collins did not have much patience for what Colonel Lansdale was saying, and so Collins cut him off and said, I am the personal representative of the President of the United States here, mister, and you're out of order. Sit down. Well, at that point, most colonels being told off by a four-star general would in fact sit down, but remember, Ed Lansdale was a maverick. He was a troublemaker, and so his reply was, he said, sir, you may be the personal representative of the President of the United States, but I am confident that if the people of the United States heard what you were saying, they would disagree with you. And I'm here to speak up on behalf of the people of the United States. On behalf of the people of the United States, we're walking out on you. And out he walked out the door. Well, as you can imagine, very few colonels are able to survive such impertinence to a four-star general. The fact that Lansdale, in fact, was not cashiered on the spot was evidence of the very high level of backing that he had in Washington from the Dulles brothers, CIA Director Allen Dulles and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. They were fans of Ed Lansdale, and at the end of the day, they had more power than any general, even a four-star general, in the U.S. Army. And that fact proved of crucial importance during the pivotal episode of Diem's consolidation of power in the spring of 1955 when he sent the Vietnamese army into the streets of Saigon to battle all these sect militias that threatened to take control of the country, these French-controlled sect militias. It was touch and go for a while, and General Collins wanted to abandon Diem and call for a new government, but Lansdale went around his back, went straight to the Dulles brothers, and got President Eisenhower to overrule his ambassador and eventually to relieve his ambassador. So here was this mere colonel who was outwitting and ultimately firing a four-star general. As a result of all that, by the time that Ed Lansdale left Vietnam at the end of 1956, the situation from Washington's perspective looked to be pretty positive. Diem is seen here touring some of the countryside, some of the areas pacified by Lansdale, and he looked like a major Cold War success story, just as Magsaysay did in the Philippines. Diem was given a ticker tape parade on Broadway. He was lauded by Life magazine as the miracle man of Vietnam. He was seen as a bulwark against communism in Southeast Asia. And of course, for those in the know, the person who was really responsible for Diem's success was Ed Lansdale. And so he came back to Washington in 1957, a great hero in the secret world of people who were able to read his highly classified reports. And here he is receiving a medal from Vice President Nixon as his wife Helen looks on. His fame was growing even outside the secret world because in the 1950s you saw the publication of Graham Greene's novel, The Quiet American, and another best-selling novel, The Ugly American. And Ed Lansdale was widely thought to be the model for the protagonist of both books, although that was something that Graham Greene always denied. Among those who were enamored of Ed Lansdale were the Kennedy brothers when they took power in 1961. They admired Lansdale. They thought of him as the American James Bond, as the T. Lawrence of Asia, the Ugly American. He had all sorts of nicknames for a supposedly secret agent. He was actually pretty darn famous by the early 1960s. But ultimately his fame would prove his undoing, not only because it engendered so much jealousy and backbiting among his colleagues in the U.S. government, but also because it gave the Kennedys an unrealistic expectation of what Ed Lansdale could do. They thought of Lansdale when they were dealing with the number one threat that they faced, or what they thought was the number one threat. And of course, it was this man, Fidel Castro. As you know, one of the very first things that occurred in the Kennedy administration was the disastrous Bay of Pigs operation. And as a result of that, the Kennedys developed an obsession with Castro because they thought that he had humiliated President Kennedy, and so they were going to take him out any way they could, whether it was overthrow him, kill him. They didn't really care. They just wanted to get rid of Castro. But they had lost faith in the CIA, which had been behind the Bay of Pigs. And so when the Kennedys thought about how do we get rid of Castro, they thought, let's go to Ed Lansdale, who by then was working at the Pentagon, where he was running special operations, because Lansdale was not a part of the CIA anymore. He was an outsider with this outsized reputation as a can-do, covert action operative. And so at the end of 1961, the Kennedys appointed Ed Lansdale to run Operation Mongoose, the interagency effort to overthrow or kill Castro. Now, Lansdale knew what a tough task he had ahead of him, and he essentially concluded in fairly short order that the only way you were going to get rid of Castro anytime soon was with an American military invasion of Cuba. But the Kennedys did not want to do that. They didn't want to commit American troops into combat. What they wanted was some kind of magical covert action solution that would enable them to overthrow Castro without risking any American troops in battle. And so as a result of that, Ed Lansdale and the people that he worked with at the CIA, state, et cetera, had to come up with all these creative gimmicks. Like, for example, this one. This was a CIA propaganda leaflet featuring Gusano Libre, free worm, because Castro called his enemies worms. And so the CIA tried to turn that worm label against Castro. And this is a leaflet intended for smuggling into Cuba, showing free worm sabotaging power lines in Cuba. This has to be one of the cutest mascots that any insurgency has ever had, but unfortunately, it didn't achieve much. There were a lot of propaganda ploys that were talked about, but at the end of the day, they amounted to very little because Castro was securely in power. The one thing that Operation Mongoose did do was to generate the intelligence in the fall of 1962 that allowed policymakers in Washington to find out that the Soviets were putting nuclear missiles into Cuba. But after the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, Operation Mongoose was disbanded, and Ed Lansdale was essentially left defenseless before his bureaucratic enemies because he had now lost the favor of the Kennedys because he had not delivered on their number one priority, which was getting rid of Castro. And among Lansdale's foremost bureaucratic enemies was his own boss, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. These guys were like oil and water. McNamara, the former CEO of the Ford Motor Company, Harvard Business School graduate, and a man who thought that numbers contained the meaning of existence. Very different from Ed Lansdale, the UCLA dropout, who didn't have all this advanced education, but did have a lot of on-the-ground time in Southeast Asia. One of the very first times that Lansdale and McNamara met was in early 1961 when Lansdale had just returned from a visit to Vietnam, and he walked into McNamara's office with a load of these rusty weapons caked in mud and blood, very simple weapons liberated from the Viet Cong, rusty muskets and spears and sharpened sticks and so forth. And he dumped this load of dirty weapons on McNamara's immaculate desk and said to the secretary, Mr. Secretary, these are the weapons that are being used by our enemies in Vietnam. They don't look like soldiers. They wear black pajamas. But they are darn good fighters. And in fact, they are licking our side, even though we equip our Vietnamese soldiers with our own equipment, our uniforms, make them into a mirror image of our army. But nevertheless, these guerrillas in black pajamas with these very simple weapons are licking our side because they have the power of an idea, the power of an ideal. And the only way we're going to defeat them is if we have an ideal of our own to offer the people of Vietnam. We're never going to bomb these people into submission. Now, in hindsight, that was pretty wise advice, but McNamara, who's one of the best and the brightest, was securely armored in his ignorance and arrogance, and so he dismissed Ed Lansdale. He thought he was just an idiot who didn't understand the higher arithmetic logic that McNamara was applying to the conflict. And by 1963, Lansdale was without voice in Vietnam policy and was on his way to being forcibly retired from the Pentagon, which was a tragedy because 1963 was also the year of this growing crisis in South Vietnam with Buddhist monks setting themselves on fire to protest the Diem regime. and the Kennedy administration concluding as a result of that, that the only way they were going to defeat the communists was by overthrowing Diem. Now, this was something that Lansdale counseled against. He said, yes, Diem has his problems. He's not a man of the people. He's too influenced by his conspiratorial brother, No Din Nu. But, the way to deal with that is send me over there, and I will get close to Diem again, and I will reconcile him with the United States. I will convince him to take a more conciliatory approach to his own people. But because there was so much bureaucratic opposition to Diem, he was to Lansdale, he was never sent over there. And the Kennedy administration ignored his advice, even when he told them, I know the generals, the people who want to overthrow Diem, and if they succeed, they are going to be less legitimate, less effective, less honest than Diem was with all of his problems. That advice was completely ignored, and so on November 1 of 1963, the military coup against Diem went ahead with U.S. backing, and the next day, Diem and his brother were murdered. The consequences of this coup were every bit as disastrous as Lansdale had predicted. The Viet Cong stepped up their infiltrations into South Vietnam, and South Vietnam itself was plunged into chaos and turmoil because you had one military coup following another. All the generals changed over, all the district and province governors changed over. The government was essentially falling apart, even as this slow-motion invasion from the north was increasing, and such that by 1965, Lyndon Johnson decided he had no choice but to send American combat troops into Vietnam. That was the last thing that Ed Lansdale ever wanted to see. He never wanted to see 500,000 American troops thrashing around the jungles of Vietnam. But it was perhaps the inevitable consequence of this tragic error of overthrowing Diem and Americanizing the war effort. In 1965, Ed Lansdale, who by that point already realized what a dire situation we were in, went back to Vietnam to try to help, working at the embassy, working for Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge. And just like Lansdale's relationship with McNamara, his relationship with Lodge was not a good one. Lodge, after all, had been the ambassador who had overseen the anti-Diem coup and was essentially responsible for murdering Lansdale's friend. And he was, again, one of the best and brightest, this Boston Brahmin who thought he knew better, even though he understood very little about Vietnamese society. Now, in the past, in the 1950s, Lansdale had no problem going around his bosses and overruling them, but he was not so powerful in the mid-1960s because his primary patron within the U.S. government was this man, Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, who was well-meaning and understood Lansdale, but also practically powerless when it came to the Johnson administration's conduct of the war in Vietnam. And Lansdale's tried to exert influence in Vietnam by working with this man, Win Cao Ki, this flashy air vice marshal who became prime minister and later vice president. But Ki was outmaneuvered by other generals in the military junta, and so as a result of that, Lansdale had neither a local protege nor a top-level defender in Washington, and so he could do nothing but watch in helpless horror as the war effort continued according to the conventional imperatives of General William Westmoreland. And Westmoreland was genuinely convinced that he could kill the Viet Cong faster than they could be replaced. Lansdale consistently told them, no, it wasn't going to work. The only way you're going to win is by fostering a stable, legitimate, and popular government in Saigon that can win the allegiance of its people. That advice was ignored, and the tragic consequences became evident to most Americans, if already evident to quite a few, but evident to most, 50 years ago this month with the Tet Offensive. Lansdale was actually in Vietnam at the time, and he very quickly perceived that the Tet Offensive was not this great victory, as General Westmoreland tried to claim, because there had been the communists had not succeeded in igniting a general uprising. That was true, but Lansdale understood that it was a powerful psychological blow against the war effort, because the fact that the Viet Cong were able to stage these attacks all across the South exposed this hollow, the rhetoric coming from Westmoreland and Johnson about how there was light at the end of the tunnel. When Lansdale finally left Vietnam for the last time in the summer of 1968, he was very dejected, defeated, and demoralized because he understood that the war was all but lost. And so he was not terribly surprised in 1975 when North Vietnam invaded and occupied the South, which by then was the husk of a state. Now, the intriguing question to ask, which I ask in my book with the title, The Road Not Taken, was there another road that we could have taken? And I submit that there was. If Ed Lansdale and others like him, like John Paul Vann perhaps, had been more listened to, That doesn't necessarily mean that we would have won a war, because North Vietnam would have been a very formidable adversary under any circumstances with more will to win than the United States had. But one thing I can guarantee you is that if Lansdale had been listened to, we would not have lost 58,000 Americans in Vietnam, and we would not have had millions of Vietnamese killed in the crossfire, because he never wanted to see this large conventional Americanized war effort. He wanted to defend South Vietnam, but he wanted the South Vietnamese to be on the front lines of their own defense, aided by American advisors, but not by American combat troops on the front lines. And he was haunted to the end of his days by the great what ifs. What if his advice had been taken? And I think it's fair to say that it was a tragic mistake that he was not listened to, but he was in part responsible for his own fate, because Ed Lansdale's Achilles heel was that he was tremendously skilled at influencing foreign governments, but he was very, very bad at influencing his own government. He viewed the American government bureaucracy as an enemy, and by so viewing it, turned it into an enemy and made it impossible for him to exert the kind of influence he perhaps should have exerted. So he ended his days feeling very much a beaten and defeated man, but there was a happy coda to his personal life, which was that after the death of his first wife, Helen, Pat Kelly, who recently retired from the U.S. Embassy in Manila, a grandmother by now and never having remarried, moved to the United States. And on July 4th, 1973, Ed and Pat married. And this is them in the kitchen of their house in Northern Virginia. And they lived happily ever after together until Ed Lansdale's own death from natural causes in 1987. And I must say, after having spent the last 5 years researching Lansdale's life, it was a very moving experience for me to visit his grave at Arlington National Cemetery, because, I felt like by now I know him better than I know my own father, and better in some ways even than his own kids did, because I discovered all these other aspects of him. And I really tried to tell the story in the book, which is more than a military history. It's also a romance, it's a spy story, it's an adventure. And I think it also finally has some resonance for the present day, because remember, today we are engaged in another great counterinsurgency, this time not against communist insurgents of the kind that Lansdale was fighting, but against Islamist insurgents. And how are we going to defeat the forces of jihadism if we defeat them? We're not going to do it by sending hundreds of thousands of American troops to occupy the greater Middle East. Been there, done that, tried that, didn't like it, not going to do it again anytime soon. So if we're going to beat the forces of Islamism, we're not going to do it with American combat troops. We're going to do it with American advisors. And when you think about American advisors, you have to think about Ed Lansdale, because he was one of the most successful and storied advisors of the 20th century. And he has lessons that are well worth studying. They're not all positive, by the way. He wasn't proud of the fact that he had no linguistic ability, that he couldn't pick up the local languages. That was a weakness. But he made up for it with his tremendous empathy and emotional intelligence, his understanding, his friendship. And those are all skill sets that I would argue we're going to need in order to defeat our enemies on today's battlefield, just as we needed them in the 1950s and 60s. And I hope with my book to revive some interest in Lansdale and to enhance understanding of both his strengths and his weaknesses as we think about the challenges ahead. So thank you for listening, and I would be delighted to take questions or comments. And I believe that there are microphones on either side of the room.
Thank you for your talk and your research. Quick question, just for clarification. You said he joined OSS, but your last slide up there showed he was with the Air Force. Can you talk about the dynamics of that? Obviously, today there were a lot of pictures of him in uniform. So how was he representing himself versus what he wasn't supposed to be representing in civilian clothes, what we see normally of agencies like that?
Well, Ed Lansdale had many bureaucratic masters and one passion, which was serving the United States. He actually, to chart the progression of his career outside of advertising, as I said, he joined OSS in World War II. Then he joined the Army and became part of Army intelligence. He was sent out to the Philippines in 1945 on behalf of Army intelligence. He later became an Army public affairs officer in Manila at the direct personal command of no less than General Douglas MacArthur. And then he transferred to the Air Force, even though he wasn't a pilot or navigator, because he thought that the Air Force would have, as a news service, would be more receptive to fresh thinking. And then he had his greatest triumphs having been seconded from the Air Force to first the Office of Policy Coordination and then the CIA. And then after the end of his assignment in Vietnam at the end of 1956, he went back to the United States, did not find a permanent home at the CIA, returned to wearing his Air Force uniform, and became an official within the Pentagon in charge of special operations, and eventually rose by the time of his retirement in 1963 to be a two-star general in the Air Force. But he was a very, very strange general in the Air Force who had very, very little connection to the Air Force itself. He was always off doing something else, even when he was wearing an Air Force uniform. And he was undoubtedly the most prominent counterinsurgent in the history of the Air Force, but truthfully, there's not a lot of competition for that honor. Sir.
Thank you very, very much for a fascinating talk. Could you say a few words about what role, if any, Lansdale played in blocking the 1954 election that had been prescribed by the Geneva Convention? What you described in terms of his work in helping to manage the elections in the Philippines for a successful outcome, I would have thought he would have seen that as an avenue that would be worth pursuing and possibly strengthening the Southern voice in the unification election.
Well, there was, in fact, an election in Vietnam in 1956, but it wasn't the election called for by the 1954 Geneva Convention, which I think is what you're referring to, because the Geneva Convention in 1954 called for Vietnam to be split up into North and South, but then to have a reunification election within 2 years' time, which would have been in 1956. But this was not an election that the U.S. was ever going to allow to occur. And in fairness, the United States was not actually a party to the Geneva Convention, was not bound by it, nor was South Vietnam actually a party to the Geneva Convention. And the reason they weren't going to allow the election is pretty simple, because they knew that Ho Chi Minh was going to win it. Not only because Ho Chi Minh was this great popular hero who had defeated the French, but also because he exerted police state control over North Vietnam, which was more populous than South Vietnam. And so there was no real hope of getting a free and fair election. Now, in hindsight, if the United States had been bent on an exit strategy from Vietnam, this would have been an obvious off-ramp where we could have allowed the election to go forward. Vietnam then gets peaceably unified in 1956 under Ho Chi Minh, and we avoid, of course, the horrors of war and the eventual defeat in the 1970s. That's with the benefit of hindsight. But in the mid-1950s, nobody in the U.S. government was thinking along those lines. Their concern was the domino theory. They thought that if we lost Vietnam, then Thailand and Indonesia and other countries in East Asia would shortly thereafter fall to the communists. And so they were never going to allow the communists to take over via whether it was the ballot box or at gunpoint. They were going to prevent this communist takeover at any cost. And so there was another election that actually occurred in Vietnam in 1956, which Diem held to oust Emperor Bao Dai, who was essentially a puppet of the French, and to proclaim a new Republic of Vietnam with himself as president. And Lansdale advised on this election and advised him to have the ballots for Diem in red, which is a propitious color in Vietnam, and the ballots for Bao Dai in green, which was a negative color. But he said, don't go beyond that. Try to have a free and fair election, because he knew at that point Diem was actually pretty popular. But of course, Diem and his brother No Dinh Nhu, as is their wont, kind of over-egged the pudding, and they wound up winning a completely unbelievable, like 98.9% of the election, which signaled to everybody that it was essentially fraudulent, even though if he had had a free and fair election, he still probably would have won something like 70%. So this was an example of how Diem ignored Lansdale's advice and ruled in more dictatorial fashion than Lansdale wanted. And unfortunately, Lansdale didn't get much support from Washington after the initial solidification of Diem's rule. He wanted to get Diem to be less autocratic, and people in Washington didn't really care. They were happy to support this autocrat, and Ed Lansdale could foresee that if Diem continued ruling in this heavy-handed fashion, he would cause a backlash, as in fact he did, and create a new insurgency. But the Dulles brothers and others were not alive to that danger, and so Lansdale was moved out. No Dinh Nhu gained predominant hold over his brother Diem, And there was no American who really replaced Lansdale after 1956 as kind of a moderating and stabilizing force on ZM. And so over the years, ZM became increasingly autocratic and eventually became locked in this fatal confrontation with the Kennedy administration, whose terrible consequences we of course know all too well.
I joined a little late, but what persuaded you to write The Road Not Taken? Like, what encouraged you to look into Edward Lansdale's life?
Great question. I've always been fascinated by Ed Lansdale, and all the more so years ago when I met one of his closest associates, Rufus Phillips, this wonderful fellow who still lives in Northern Virginia, who was a CIA man, came out of Yale in the mid-1950s and went to work for Lansdale in Saigon, and he told me a little bit about Lansdale. And of course, from reading all these books, I was familiar with the Lansdale legend, and I even wrote a little bit about Lansdale myself in my last book, Invisible Armies, which was a history of guerrilla warfare down through the ages. And it was really my editor's idea, Bob Weil at Norton, tremendous editor, who, when we were talking about my next book, suggested, why don't you do a book on Ed Lansdale? And I said, well, I don't know, I already wrote about him, what more is there to say? And Bob Weil had this intuition that there was, in fact, a lot more to say, and boy, was he right. Because, as I mentioned in my book talk, I got my hands on this biographical goldmine, these letters that he'd written to his longtime mistress, Pat Kelly, as well as to his first wife, Helen. And I also, courtesy of the National Archives, was able to read all of these newly declassified documents. And the fact that the CIA drags its feet on declassification to, I think, a ridiculous degree actually worked out to my benefit, because I became the first historian who really had access to a lot of these newly declassified papers. And so I was able, as a result of that, to tell the Ed Lansdale story in a way that it's never been told before, and to dispel a lot of the myths, both good and bad, that have accumulated around Lansdale over the years.
Okay, thank you.
Just following up on your summary of the topic, you mentioned that a road not taken could have been a what if, and saving of 50+ thousand U.S. servicemen, as well as millions in Vietnam. What is your feeling, or is it explored in your book from that perspective? If that road was taken, would South Vietnam have fallen faster, or would there be a line today like Korea? Or what are some of the thoughts from that perspective of supporting a government in the South and letting them do the groundwork would have resulted in a different outcome?
Well, this is, of course, the great unknown, and historical counterfactuals always have to be a matter of speculation, because you don't know, and it's all too easy to say that the way things worked out was the only way they could have possibly worked out. But I don't think that's the case. I mean, there's just so much contingency in history, there's so much accident and chance, and so many difficult decisions, that if those decisions had gone a different way, there would have been a different outcome. And it's possible that the outcome would have been the very positive one that you suggested, of a free South Vietnam that would be like South Korea today, this rich, democratic, Asian tiger. I think that was a possible outcome. We don't know if that would have been the case. I think the opportunity for that was probably lost in many ways after 1963, after the ZM coup, after the destabilization of South Vietnam. But what I suggest in the book is, I don't want to make grandiose claims that, if only Ed Lansdale had been listened to, Vietnam would be this paradise, that everything would have worked out great, everything would have been in accordance with America's wishes. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, as I said in my book talk, even the worst case scenario, however, would have been a lot better than what actually transpired, because again, if the Lansdale advice had been followed, we might have still lost. South Vietnam might still have been conquered by North Vietnam, but it wouldn't have been at a cost of 58,000 American lives. It wouldn't have been at the cost of millions of Vietnamese lives. It wouldn't have been at the cost of all this civil strife here in the United States, and the dissension, and the uproar in the streets, all of the terrible damage that the Vietnam War did in the 60s and 70s. All of that would have been avoided, because, as I said, Lansdale never wanted to Americanize the war. He didn't think that we should be sending our own combat forces to fight. He didn't think that the answer to the communist threat lay in massive firepower. He thought it was in winning hearts and minds and helping the state of South Vietnam to stand up its own government that could win the support of its people. And of course, that advice became was completely ignored and became completely peripheral as the war took on its conventional contours by the mid-1960s.
Max, I'm afraid we're out of time.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Folks, don't forget there is a book signing, one level up at the Archives bookstore. 15% discount today, and we'll see you up there in just a few moments.
Plus a free autograph.